What happens when an undercover CEO decides to investigate his own bustling shopping mall? Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story of leadership, empathy, and transformation. When Alexander Pierce, the CEO of Grandline Mall, went undercover as a maintenance worker, he uncovered shocking problems hidden behind polished storefronts. But in the midst of dysfunction, he also found true integrity in Luis, a dedicated security guard striving to make a difference. Stick around to see how Alexander's courageous mission turned the mall around and inspired lasting change. Let's dive in. Alexander Carter, the CEO of Grandline Properties, had built his luxury shopping mall empire on the principles of quality service, aesthetic appeal, and customer satisfaction. However, recent complaints had begun to tarnish that polished reputation. Reports of poor employee morale, equipment breakdowns, and neglect from middle management at one of his flagship malls had reached his ears. Customers were frustrated with delays, cleanliness issues, and inconsistent maintenance problems. Problems Alexander knew couldn't be fixed from behind a corporate desk. Instead of delegating the investigation to his executives or relying solely on filtered reports, Alexander decided to take a more direct approach. Determined to uncover the truth, he devised a plan to go undercover as a maintenance worker named Alex. Disguised in shabby overalls and a faded baseball cap, he arrived at the Grandline Mall one rainy morning, prepared to blend in with the overlooked workforce. His goal was simple: observe, understand, and identify the real causes of the ongoing issues. He knew the risks. If his identity was exposed, the staff might revert to scripted professionalism and hide their frustrations. But Alexander was ready to see his company from a new perspective, even if it meant getting his hands dirty. As he walked through the mall's side entrance, his heart raced with both anticipation and apprehension. This wasn't just about fixing broken systems. It was about reconnecting with the people who kept his empire running. Alexander's first few days working as Alex at Grandline Mall were an eye-opener. The luxury mall's exterior gleamed with sophistication, but behind the scenes, things were far from perfect. As a maintenance worker, Alexander's tasks were grueling, monotonous, and often thankless. He spent his shifts cleaning restrooms, repairing flickering lights, and unclogging pipes while the mall's well-dressed patrons strolled by, oblivious to his efforts. The uniform he wore, a faded blue jumpsuit with frayed edges, granted him a cloak of invisibility, allowing him to navigate the mall unnoticed. Despite his low profile, Alexander quickly picked up on the underlying issues plaguing the workforce. Equipment breakdowns were frequent, with outdated tools and inadequate supplies hindering even the most basic tasks. Radios used for communication between maintenance staff often crackled with static, making coordination nearly impossible. Maintenance carts wobbled on squeaky wheels, their contents jumbled due to poor organization. Alexander found himself fixing things with makeshift solutions, much to the frustration of his coworkers. The tension among the employees was palpable. Workers grumbled about the lack of support from management and how their concerns were routinely ignored. Requests for better equipment or more reasonable schedules were met with excuses or outright dismissal. Alexander listened to their complaints, careful not to draw attention to himself. His colleagues regarded him with a mix of indifference and suspicion. Just another temporary hire, destined to quit after a few weeks. But what disturbed Alexander the most was the management's dismissive attitude toward the workers. During breaks, he overheard supervisors belittling their staff, complaining about their supposed laziness rather than acknowledging the harsh working conditions they endured. The gap between management's polished exterior and the reality of the employees' struggles was wider than Alexander had imagined. Every observation, every offhand comment, and every dismissive gesture Alexander witnessed fueled his determination. What he had seen so far only confirmed his worst fears. The mall's problems ran deeper than faulty equipment or missed quotas. They stemmed from a lack of empathy and respect, a culture of negligence that Alexander was now committed to confronting. Alexander's undercover mission took an unexpected turn when he crossed paths with Luis Romero, a young janitor working the same late-night shifts. Luis was in his mid-20s, with dark hair that constantly fell over his forehead and eyes that carried a quiet resilience. Though Luis's uniform was worn and his shoes had seen better days, his dedication to his work was evident. Alexander first noticed him one evening, struggling to maneuver a clunky cleaning cart down a narrow corridor near the mall's atrium. "Need a hand?" Alexander asked, casually offering to steady the cart as Luis wrestled with a stuck wheel. "Thanks, man, this thing's older than me," Luis replied with a sheepish grin. His tone was friendly but weary, as if exhaustion had become his natural state. Their initial exchange soon blossomed into camaraderie as the two men began to share their breaks. Alexander appreciated Luis's genuine nature and the way he took pride in his work despite the unfavorable conditions. Luis often vented about the frustrations he faced, from outdated tools to inadequate pay, but his complaints were always laced with humor, a defense mechanism against the harshness of his reality. "Management's always talking about how the mall's image is everything," Luis joked one night, wiping sweat from his brow, "but I guess we're not part of the image they care about." Alexander chuckled at the joke, but the truth behind it cut deep. Luis was a skilled worker, meticulous and attentive to detail, but his efforts were consistently overlooked by supervisors who only cared about cutting costs and boosting profits. The equipment he relied on was outdated and inefficient, yet requests for replacements were routinely ignored. What struck Alexander most was Luis's dedication to his family. Luis confided that he worked long hours at the mall and juggled a part-time job on weekends to help support his younger sister, Sophia, who had been diagnosed with a chronic illness. "It's rough," Luis admitted one night, his voice low and his gaze distant. "But Sophia's tough. She doesn't complain, so I can't either." Alexander found himself admiring Luis's perseverance and integrity. Despite his circumstances, Luis continued to approach his job with diligence and compassion, treating both co-workers and customers with kindness. It was clear that Luis's struggles extended far beyond the mall's walls, and yet he faced them head-on without complaint. Alexander saw something remarkable in the young man, a resilience that deserved recognition, and as their conversations grew deeper, Alexander realized Luis could be a key ally in his mission to change the toxic culture within Grandline Mall. Luis's integrity was evident in every aspect of his work, but it was also the very trait that left him feeling constantly disillusioned. As the weeks passed, Alexander witnessed Luis's tireless dedication, even when it went unnoticed or, worse, actively discouraged. Luis took pride in maintaining the pristine appearance of Grandline Mall's sprawling corridors, food courts, and high-end boutiques. Yet no matter how spotless the marble floors shone, or how efficiently he completed his rounds, his efforts were met with little more than apathy from management. Luis often shared his frustrations with Alexander during their late-night breaks. "They act like we're disposable," he would vent, shaking his head. "I've asked for new mops and cleaning supplies for months. They just tell me to make do or that it's not in the budget." Meanwhile, they're renovating the executive offices for the third time this year. Luis's resentment wasn't just about inadequate tools. It was about the blatant disregard for those who made the mall's polished appearance possible. What angered Luis most, however, was the hypocrisy. Management preached about maintaining Grandline Mall's luxurious reputation, yet failed to invest in the very people who made that image possible. Luis spoke passionately about how maintenance workers like him were treated as second-class employees, their concerns dismissed as trivial. "We're invisible to them unless something's wrong," he remarked bitterly. "If a spill gets missed or a light's out, suddenly we're incompetent. But when do we bust our backs to keep things running smoothly?" Silence. But Luis's frustration never translated into slacking off. If anything, it fueled his commitment to doing a good job, as if proving his worth through sheer effort. His commitment extended beyond his official duties. When he noticed a child lost in the bustling crowds, he didn't hesitate to guide them to safety, ensuring they were reunited with their anxious parents. When a customer spilled coffee across a marble floor and was too embarrassed to ask for help, Luis approached with a reassuring smile and handled the mess without complaint. Alexander quickly understood that Luis's integrity was both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. Despite his grievances, Luis remained true to his values, even if it meant working himself to exhaustion. But Alexander could see the toll it was taking. Luis's eyes grew darker with fatigue, his shoulders more hunched beneath the weight of constant frustration. And yet, Luis continued to push forward, driven by a sense of duty that management had failed to acknowledge. Alexander knew Luis's perseverance was exactly what he needed to help turn Grandline Mall's toxic culture around. Alexander's undercover mission revealed more than just surface-level frustrations. It uncovered a deeper, systemic problem within Grandline Mall's operations. As days turned into weeks, Alexander continued to observe and document the daily realities of the maintenance staff, and what he found was both alarming and infuriating. Equipment was outdated, resources were constantly stretched thin, and any requests for improvements were routinely ignored or brushed aside by upper management. But worse than the material neglect was the culture of dismissiveness that permeated the workplace. During his breaks with Luis, Alexander pieced together a troubling pattern. Complaints about broken tools or inadequate supplies were rarely escalated, and when they were, management responded with vague promises or outright indifference. Luis revealed that a request for new cleaning carts had been pending for over a year, the old ones creaking and wobbling to the point of near conception. "Every time I bring it up, they tell me it's on the list," Luis said, his tone laced with bitterness. "But somehow, the list never gets shorter, only longer." What Alexander found most disturbing, however, was the arbitrary enforcement of rules designed to control rather than support the employees. Luis shared how he had been written up for spending too much time assisting an elderly woman who had slipped near an escalator. "They said I was neglecting my duties," Luis recalled. His eyes darkened with frustration. "But what was I supposed to do, just leave her there?" Such incidents were not isolated. Several other workers Alexander spoke with shared similar stories of being reprimanded for acts of basic kindness or initiative. Beyond that, Alexander noticed the alarming disparity in how resources were allocated. While the janitorial staff received substandard supplies, luxury boutiques within the mall were constantly remodeled, their pristine facades gleaming with the latest renovations. The clear favoritism was demoralizing, sending a message that those who did the hardest work were the least valued. The emphasis on superficial appearances over genuine quality of service reflected a broader disconnect between management and the employees on the ground. Furthermore, the toxic environment fostered by certain supervisors only made things worse. Alexander frequently overheard Constance Price, the head of maintenance, berating staff members for minor infractions while ignoring their valid concerns about safety hazards and equipment failures. Her management style was built on intimidation rather than inspiration, and it was clear her priority was maintaining her own reputation rather than ensuring the well-being of her team. The deeper Alexander dug, the more apparent it became that Grandline Mall's problems weren't just about faulty equipment or budget cuts. They were about a culture of negligence, hypocrisy, and disregard for the very people who kept the place running. And as his findings accumulated, Alexander knew that simply replacing old tools or scolding harsh supervisors wouldn't be enough. To truly fix Grandline Mall, he would need to uproot the complacency and rebuild its foundations from the ground up. Determined to build a case strong enough to force real change, Alexander began methodically gathering evidence of Grandline Mall's failings. Over the next 2 weeks, he expanded his investigation, spending hours each day documenting the workplace's inefficiencies, toxic culture, and blatant disregard for employee welfare. Equipped with a small, discreet camera and a voice recorder hidden in his work belt, Alexander captured a multitude of incidents that painted a damning picture of neglect and corruption. He recorded Constance Price berating Luis for taking a 10-minute break after an exhausting shift, her voice dripping with disdain as she accused him of slacking off. "You think anyone cares how tired you are? You're paid to work, not whine," she snapped, dismissing his valid concerns about faulty equipment. Alexander also documented the continued use of malfunctioning machinery that management had refused to replace, including the crumbling cleaning carts Luis had mentioned. With every creak and squeak of the cart's wheels, Alexander's frustration grew. One particularly telling incident occurred when Alexander followed Luis to a storage area where damaged supplies were routinely dumped instead of repaired or replaced. He filmed as Luis showed him a pile of broken mop handles, empty cleaning fluid containers, and torn uniforms. "Supplies that should have been replenished months ago. We're told to make do," Luis said bitterly, But how can we do our jobs right if they won't even give us the tools we need? Alexander's phone captured the weariness in Luis' voice, the resignation that came from years of being ignored. Alexander's evidence also extended to the overall work environment. He noted how Luis and others were often assigned double shifts without proper compensation or time to rest. When employees raised concerns, their complaints were either ignored or met with retaliatory scheduling meant to silence them. Alexander kept detailed notes on the discrepancies between the hours reported by workers and those logged by management. It became evident that supervisors were intentionally shortchanging employees to inflate productivity metrics. Even more damning was Alexander's discovery of Constance's manipulation of maintenance reports. By inflating the department's expenses on paper, she justified budget cuts while funneling resources into other areas that bolstered her own performance reviews. It was a vicious cycle, one designed to benefit those at the top while punishing those at the bottom. With every piece of evidence he collected, Alexander's resolve hardened. The time for observation was over. It was time to confront the rot festering within Grandline Mall. The day of reckoning arrived with an early morning meeting scheduled at Grandline Mall's administrative office. Alexander, dressed once more in his maintenance uniform, entered the brightly lit office lobby, his expression unreadable. He had contacted Mr. Henson, the general manager, under the guise of discussing pressing concerns related to the maintenance department's performance. Mr. Henson, a polished man in his early 50s with graying hair and a perpetually cold stare, waited impatiently behind his mahogany desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against a sleek tablet. Beside him stood Constance Price, her gaze sharp and suspicious as she eyed Alexander's grim expression. "Make it quick," Mr. Henson barked as Alexander took a seat. "We're not running a charity here. If this is about your little complaints over equipment or shifts, you'd better have something substantial to say." "Actually, it's about something far more serious," Alexander replied, his voice steady and firm. He reached into his backpack and produced a tablet of his own, turning the screen toward Mr. Henson. "I've spent the last 2 weeks documenting everything that's been happening here. The faulty equipment, the deliberate mistreatment of employees, the unethical manipulation of maintenance budgets. I have audio recordings, photos, and logs of every incident." Mr. Henson's brow furrowed as he glanced at the files on the screen. Constance's face, however, turned an alarming shade of white. "You can't just barge in here making accusations," she snapped, her voice tight with panic. "You're a janitor, nothing more." "Actually, I'm Alexander Rivers, CEO of Rivers Holdings," Alexander said, his calm declaration cutting through the air like a knife. "And Grandline Mall is one of my largest investments. This investigation was never about complaining employees. It was about uncovering why this mall's reputation has been plummeting, despite the reports your department files each month." Mr. Henson's jaw went slack, his fingers now trembling as they rested against the desk. "Mr. Rivers, I had no idea." "No, you didn't. And that's part of the problem," Alexander continued, his tone icy. "You've been so focused on maintaining appearances and boosting your own performance metrics that you've allowed corruption to fester under your nose. Constance has been manipulating reports to justify budget cuts while pocketing bonuses meant for genuine improvements. And you, Mr. Henson, have been so fixated on hitting arbitrary targets that you ignored the voices of those keeping this place running." Constance began to stammer out a denial, but Alexander silenced her with a glare. "Security will be escorting you both from the premises. Effective immediately, your employment here is terminated. And don't bother pleading innocence. I've already forwarded my findings to the board of directors." The room fell into a stunned silence. Mr. Henson's shoulders sagged, his bluster replaced by a hollow resignation. Constance's eyes darted wildly, her composure shattered. Alexander's gaze never wavered. Justice had been served, but his work was far from over. There were still people who deserved recognition, and a system in desperate need of repair. With Mr. Henson and Constance removed from their positions, Alexander wasted no time implementing the changes he had envisioned for Grandline Mall. That very afternoon, he called a meeting with the remaining staff, his demeanor far different from the aloof executive most had only seen in portraits or read about in business publications. Alexander's presence was direct, purposeful, and genuine. Standing before the employees gathered in the food court, a place usually buzzing with customers but now eerily silent, Alexander addressed them not as a distant leader, but as someone who had walked in their shoes. "I've spent the last 2 weeks working alongside you all," Alexander began, his voice steady and clear. "And what I've seen is a team of hard-working, dedicated individuals trying to do their best despite being given the worst tools and support. That ends today." The room filled with murmurs of surprise and curiosity. Alexander continued. "Effective immediately, Grandline Mall will undergo a complete overhaul of its maintenance operations. Faulty equipment will be replaced, scheduling issues will be addressed, and most importantly, every employee's concerns will be taken seriously. This mall can only thrive if the people keeping it running are respected and valued." Alexander's gaze settled on Luis, who stood at the back of the group, his arms folded tightly across his chest as if bracing for another empty promise. "Luis Romero," Alexander called out, causing the young man's eyes to widen. "Your dedication to this place and your team has not gone unnoticed. You spoke out against the problems others tried to hide, even when it meant risking your own job. That's the kind of leadership this place needs." Luis's mouth opened in shock, his usual stoicism crumbling. I was just trying to do the right thing," he stammered, his cheeks flushing. "And you did," Alexander replied with a smile, "which is why I'm promoting you to operations supervisor. Your job will be to oversee the maintenance department, ensure problems are addressed before they escalate, and advocate for the needs of your team. I trust you to do what's right, not just what's easy." Luis's expression was a mix of disbelief and gratitude. The other employees clapped and cheered, their morale lifting for the first time in years. Alexander's reform plan was already in motion, but he knew the true change would come from empowering leaders like Luis, who had the courage to speak up and the integrity to make things better. Months after the sweeping changes at Grandline Mall, the difference was undeniable. Alexander's reform plan had transformed the once neglected and dysfunctional property into a vibrant, welcoming destination for both visitors and employees. Luis Romero, now operations supervisor, proved himself to be a natural leader. His dedication and empathy resonated with the maintenance crew, fostering an atmosphere of mutual respect and collaboration. Equipment was upgraded, schedules were adjusted to prevent burnout, and most importantly, employees' concerns were addressed with urgency. Alexander made a habit of visiting Grandline Mall frequently, not just to inspect operations, but to genuinely engage with the staff. He often found himself in the break room, chatting with Luis and his team, listening to their feedback and sharing a laugh over cheap coffee and homemade pastries Luis sometimes brought from his mother's bakery. Luis's promotion had lifted his family out of financial hardship, allowing them to expand their small bakery and hire additional help. The mall's performance soared as customer satisfaction increased and complaints became rare. But for Alexander, the true success was seeing his employees thrive. The loyalty and commitment he witnessed from Luis and others reaffirmed his belief that integrity and empathy were just as important as business acumen. As he walked through the bustling corridors of Grandline Mall one morning, the cheerful voices of employees greeting him by name, Alexander knew that he had built something lasting. Not just a successful enterprise, but a community rooted in trust and respect. And for him, that was worth more than all the profits in the world. The story of Alexander Pierce's undercover investigation at Grandline Mall teaches an invaluable lesson about leadership, integrity, and the power of genuine empathy. Alexander's journey reveals that true leadership goes beyond managing profits and statistics. It requires understanding the struggles and needs of the very people who keep the business running. By stepping away from his position of authority and immersing himself in the day-to-day realities of his employees, Alexander discovered issues that formal reports and distant management couldn't reveal. The experience demonstrated that empowering those with integrity and passion, like Luis Romero, leads to lasting positive change. Luis's promotion highlighted the importance of recognizing hard work and sincerity, proving that the right leadership can emerge from the most unexpected places. Furthermore, Alexander's commitment to ongoing engagement and open communication with his employees emphasized that building trust is a continuous process. His reforms transformed not only the mall's operations but also its culture, making it a place where people felt valued and heard. The story teaches that successful leadership is rooted in empathy, authenticity, and the courage to acknowledge mistakes and take meaningful action to address them.